Mattel butchered Thomas. That's the general consensus from all the fans of Thomas and Friends and its original guys. They believe that Mattel destroyed what Thomas and Friends was and is solely responsible for what it has become. I've been pretty vocal about not being the biggest fan of Mattel. Not necessarily people that work for Mattel, but the corporation as a whole. It seeks short-term profits rather than long-term gains. Like any big conglomerate, it doesn't really care about the fans that it supposedly is trying to appease. But there was a time when Mattel actually seemed like it was doing right by Thomas and Friends, and we couldn't give them enough praise at the time. So, have Mattel really butchered Thomas and Friends? Let's get into it. Before I start, I want to make it clear, these are all my own personal opinions, and your thoughts may be different than mine. It's one thing that makes our fandom so unique. So let me know in the comments if you think Mattel butchered Thomas and Friends. All I ask is that you be respectful, and above all, enjoy the video. But before I go into some of my thoughts around Mattel, how did Mattel acquire Thomas and Friends? Well, in 2010, Hit Entertainment closed its toy company, called Hit Toy Company, and made a deal with Mattel's Fisher-Price to start producing Thomas toys. Then in April 2011, Apex Partners, who owned Hit Entertainment at the time, announced that they were putting Hit Entertainment up for sale. And many companies were interested in Hit Entertainment, such as Disney, Saban, and Hasbro. There was even an offer on the table that you could either buy Hit Entertainment's entire back catalogue, which included Thomas and Friends, Fireman Sam, Pingu, and a bunch of other properties, or just buy Thomas and Friends alone, as Thomas and Friends made up about 80% of Hit Entertainment's revenue. In February 2012, the deal was finalised that Mattel would purchase Hit Entertainment and all of its back catalogue, including Thomas and Friends, for between $650 million and $680 million, usually depending on who you ask. The consensus seems to be around $650 million though. And at first it seemed like Mattel was really trying to bring back the glory days of Thomas and Friends. We had been through the doldrums of the Nitrogen era, and it seemed like the show really needed to get back to basics. Andrew Brenner was made head writer, Ian McHugh, producer. They brought in a new writing staff, and even a new narrator. 2012 saw the release of season 17 of Thomas and Friends, and there was already noticeable improvements. The animation seemed to be crisper, the writing more nuanced, and not as insulting to audiences' intelligence. Even the voice acting seemed to have been given a new lease on life. From season 17 to season 21, including the movies, are now dubbed as the Brenner era of Thomas and Friends, or the Brennaissance by some fans, because it was a rebirth of the franchise. It reminded older viewers of why they loved Thomas and Friends in the first place, and brought in new fans to fall in love with the franchise. All of this happened under Mattel's watch. There's no denying that. It's a part of its history. But what's also part of its history is that in 2017, they decided to go and f it up. There's a saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The higher-ups in Mattel clearly don't know this saying, because from seasons 22 to 24, this was when the Bwaba era of Thomas and Friends began. Andrew Brenner left. Fan favourite characters such as Edward and Henry were written out of the show and replaced with Nia and Rebecca, two female characters that were only included for diversity's sake. I have no problem with diversity, but it needs to be organic to how the show is portrayed. Not just, here's two female characters in the main cast now, because diversity. And that on-the-nose type of pandering did not stop there. Thomas began literally seeing the world, showing up in countries like China and India, which would be great for raising awareness of other cultures, but it was done in the most ham-fisted, in-your-face way that a lot of the fandom felt that this was very racist, and rightfully so. It was done to appeal to international markets, but if international markets saw what we saw in those episodes, they would not be happy, because it was base level interpretations and stereotypes of those countries. Season 17 to 21 worked hard on trying to bring the realism back to Thomas and Friends, and then season 22 to 24 decided to strip all that away. The key complaint being the engines bouncing from side to side on the tracks of their own volition. The stories themselves started to revert back to more baby and toddler style messages and included things like those god-awful dream sequences. But there were still signs of hope in there, because the episodes that were written by Michael White, who was an avid Thomas and Friends fan, absolutely stellar work. It proved that the people within the system really cared about Thomas and Friends and tried to make it a good product. But it also wasn't helped by the fact that Mattel's toy department were pumping out the biggest load of pish that I have ever seen. Gone were the days of the Take and Play range or the Airto range from when I grew up. It was basic corporate shill mass production toys that had no heart or soul to them. And then 2020 hit, a time where a lot of people were trying to find little traces of light in the darkness that had eclipsed the world. But for Thomas and Friends fans, we got no such light, as we found out that season 24 was going to be the last of the recognised Thomas and Friends franchise canon, as the series and franchise were being rebooted to what is now known as Thomas and Friends All Engines Go. I've spoke about All Engines Go a couple of times in this channel. I try not to be too negative, because it does have its fans, and it is specifically tailored for a demographic that is not myself. The demographic is for babies and toddlers, and that's the way it's clearly going to stay. My own thoughts on Mattel, they're gits. They are the corporate shells that just do things for their own profit margins, get as much return on your investment with as little investment into said investment. But that's not just Mattel. All big conglomerates are like that. The only bottom line that those companies care about is their bottom line. At the moment, Thomas and Friends All Engines Go is making them money in some toy sales and the series that is being pumped out. But they won't get rid of the actual franchise from their books, because it looks great having a globally recognised brand like Thomas and Friends that's been on the go since 1984 under their umbrella. So do I think that Mattel butchered Thomas and Friends? I think you all know the answer to that one. But I felt it was right to point out some of the good things that did happen under Mattel's watch. Just because so much crap has happened doesn't mean you can't remember and enjoy what came before. That Brenner era was something that fans never knew they were going to get ever again. Because after season 7 and up until about season 16, we weren't sure if we would ever see the quality of Thomas and Friends content that we got in the classic seasons. But they managed to do it. And it was Mattel that gave Andrew Brenner, Ian McHugh, and those writers the chance to do it. Would it have happened if it was still under Hit Entertainment? Possible, but not likely. They were happy just to churn out what they were churning out. Many a fan of The Dark Knight will recognise this saying: you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become a villain. Mattel were the heroes of this story for a time. Up until season 21, they were the saviours of Thomas and Friends, with Andrew Brenner as the linchpin of their success. But when season 22 hit, they went full Harvey Two-Face, and the franchise has just been in steady decline ever since. But let me know in the comments what you think. Have Mattel completely butchered this franchise? Thank you all for watching, and until next time, keep on chugging.